Welcome everyone. You are listening to the account with a news summary for day 397 of the war in Ukraine. Thank you for joining me. Today I have 4 extra news segments for you. All other updates are grouped into the usual situation inside Ukraine, with updates regarding a Shahed attack that started just as the report was done, the occupied territories, containing updates about several explosions in the occupied territories, Russia and Belarus, including an investigative article regarding Russia's and Iran's support for each other, and international developments. Before we start though, the flashpoints along the front. Bakhmut. Heavy fighting continues in and around the city. Russia claims to have taken the Azov steelworks, however, so far no evidence was provided. Ukrainian sources claim the factory is still divided and contested. Street battles have been reported near the city center today. Ukraine conducted successful local counterattacks in northern Bakhmut. The front at Avdiivka and Khomove is at a standstill. Videos shared today show Ukrainian tanks operating inside Bakhmut. Considering tanks are vulnerable in urban areas, this would suggest Russia is lacking anti-tank weapons. Oleksandr Syrsky, the commander of the Ukrainian ground forces, has once again visited the hottest spots on the Bakhmut front. Syrsky emphasized that the command is considering all possible scenarios and will act appropriately to the current situation. The most intense phase of fighting for Bakhmut is underway. The situation is consistently difficult. The enemy is suffering significant losses in human resources, weapons and military equipment, but continues to conduct offensive actions. Our defenders are heroically holding back the enemy's attack in extremely difficult conditions and leaving the enemy no chance to realize its plans, he said. Avdiivka. Fighting continues in and around Avdiivka. Vitaly Barabash, head of Avdiivka military administration, announced that volunteers and journalists are banned from entering Avdiivka. This comes amid reports that Ukraine has decided to evacuate all civilians from the city. Marinka. It seems Russia has deployed additional troops to Marinka in an attempt to revive the stalled offensive here. Russia reportedly made advances north of the city and is also trying to advance in the south. And before we start the regular news segment, the probably biggest headline today. The 18 Leopard 2A6 tanks pledged by the German government have been transferred to Ukraine. Besides the main battle tanks, Germany also transferred an additional 40 Marder infantry fighting vehicles and 2 armored recovery vehicles. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has confirmed that the Leopard 2 tanks promised by the government in Berlin have arrived in Ukraine. Additionally, the 3 Leopard 2A6 promised by Portugal has been delivered as well, according to the Defense Ministry of Portugal. Oleksiy Reznikov, Ukrainian Minister of Defense, reported that he has tried out the new supply of military equipment from international partners for Ukrainian air assault troops, suggesting the vehicles are already in Ukraine. Today I had the honor to try out the newest addition to our armed units, particularly Challengers from the UK, Striker and Cougars from the US, and Marders from Germany, Reznikov said. And to start the news segment, a look at Ukrainian tank crews and new recruits completing training in the UK. Ukrainian crews have completed training in the UK on Britain's Challenger 2 main battle tanks and returned home. The UK Ministry of Defense has published a mini-film about how Ukrainian tank crews learned to operate Challenger 2 tanks that were sent to Ukraine. The almost half-an-hour-long film shows how tank crews accompanied by interpreters learn how to move on different surfaces like asphalt roads, dirt, rough terrain, and so on. New Ukrainian recruits have also completed training courses on theory and practical action at platoon level as part of basic military training. Now a look at the missile attack on Sloviansk, Donetsk Oblast. Russia attacked the city of Sloviansk, Donetsk Oblast, with 2 S-300 missiles today. The missiles hit the city center, damaging administrative and office buildings, 5 high-rise apartment blocks and 7 private houses, according to Governor Pavlo Kyrylenko. So far, 2 people died and 32 were wounded. However, the rescue operation continues. Next, the updates on President Zelensky's visit to Zaporizhzhia Oblast. As part of a working visit to Zaporizhzhia Oblast, President Volodymyr Zelensky has met with military and law enforcement officers, visited injured defenders in the hospital, and toured frontline positions, presenting state awards to soldiers. He also inspected houses damaged in the March 22nd Russian MLRS attack on the city of Zaporizhzhia and was informed of the ongoing work to clean up the aftermath. Additionally, President Zelensky and IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi visited the Dnipro hydroelectric power station, discussing the protection of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Later, President Zelensky also visited Nikopol, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which is constantly under Russian fire, and observed the consequences of the enemy's terrorist attacks on Nikopol, Marhanets, and other settlements of the oblast. A look at all the minor updates out of Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky discussed the restoration of Ukraine's schools and the repatriation of Ukrainian children forcibly taken to Russia with actor and UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador Orlando Bloom and the UNICEF team. The Security Service of Ukraine has neutralized a Russian FSB agent network that was adjusting fire at the positions of the Ukrainian armed forces in Donetsk and Kharkiv Oblast. During the recording of the report, an air alert came in for Kyiv Oblast. The launch of Shaheds was reported. Next up, the latest regarding the situation in the occupied territories. The Insider has published an investigative article into Valery Astachov, a former officer of the Berkut riot police, who allegedly has assaulted Ukrainian children illegally deported to Crimea. Several explosions were reported in the Russian-occupied city of Melitopol in Zaporizhzhia Oblast today. According to Mayor Ivan Fedorov, a building captured by Russian law enforcement was damaged as a result of the explosions. Collaborator Vladimir Rogov reported a Ukrainian artillery strike on the city, allegedly damaging a building near a college and injuring 4 people. A car belonging to Mikhail Moskvin, head of the occupier city police department, was blown up in the temporarily occupied city of Mariupol. Moskvin reportedly was injured as he was a few meters away from the car when it exploded. In the village of Novotroitske, next to Mariupol, an ammunition depot exploded, Petro Andrioschenko, the advisor to the Mariupol mayor, reported today. Moving on to the news updates from Russia and Belarus. Russia currently has 1 submarine with 4 caliber cruise missiles on active combat duty in the Black Sea. The reaction of the West will not affect Russia's plans to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, according to presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov. The Security Council of Russia claimed that Russia has a unique weapon capable of destroying even the US. Nikolai Patrushev, Secretary of the Security Council, said today, "Russia has a unique weapon, which is capable of destroying any opponent, mainly the US, in case there's a threat to Russia's existence." Russia is supplying Iran with cyber weapons, including digital surveillance tools, in order to get the relatively cheap and effective drones it uses to strike Ukrainian infrastructure facilities. Russia's 4th-generation Su-35 fighter jets are strengthening the dominance of the Russian Federation in the combat zone, which can be a worrying change for Ukraine and its partners. And to wrap up the news segment, the international developments. The German government wants to increase spending on military aid to Ukraine from €3 billion to €15 billion over the coming years. And now for the intelligence report segment. starting as usual with the UK Ministry of Defence. On March 22, 2023, at least 3 uncrewed surface vessels, USV, and 1 uncrewed aerial vehicle reportedly attempted to strike the Russian naval base of Sevastopol in occupied Crimea. Open source reports suggest that 1 USV was stopped by defensive booms, while 2 were destroyed in the harbor. Russian officials said that no Russian vessels had been damaged. A previous USV attack on Sevastopol on October 29, 2022, reportedly damaged the minesweeper Ivan Golubets and the frigate Admiral Makarov. Even though the new attacks likely failed to damage any military assets, the USV threat likely continues to constrain operations of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. A look at the latest assessment by the Institute for the Study of War. ISW is publishing an abbreviated campaign update today, March 26th. This report discusses Russian President Vladimir Putin's continued efforts to seek complete victory in Ukraine, which he appears confident that he can attain over time. Putin seems to reject the idea increasingly prevalent in Western discourse that the current military realities require or support a negotiated resolution of the conflict. Neither Ukraine nor the West has persuaded him that he must consider accepting any sort of off-ramp or compromise settlement. Putin instead remains focused on achieving his initial war aims through protracted conflict in which he wins either by imposing his will on Ukraine by force or by breaking Ukraine's will following the West's abandonment of Kyiv. Multiple successful Ukrainian counteroffensives are almost certainly necessary, but not sufficient either to persuade Putin to negotiate on acceptable terms or to create military conditions on the ground favorable enough to Ukraine and the West that continued or renewed Russian attacks pose acceptable threats to Ukraine or NATO. Russian President Vladimir Putin continues to plan to achieve his original aims in Ukraine through military force, despite growing Western sentiment to seek a settlement, the Institute stated in its latest update. According to the researchers, neither Russia's unsuccessful efforts to freeze Ukraine or Europe into submission, nor the failures of his major military efforts convinced Putin to consider negotiating. The Institute suggests that likely only a series of Ukrainian victories will convince Putin to turn to negotiations on terms other than the achievement of his territorial ambitions in Ukraine. There is reason to expect that Ukrainian forces can, in fact, make gains through counteroffensives, the Institute said. The choices before Ukraine and its Western backers at this time are thus relatively straightforward. Ukraine can unilaterally cease fighting even as Russian attacks by ground and air continue, which would lead to disastrous defeat and which almost no one is advocating. Ukrainian forces can continue fighting in a very constrained way, seeking only to hold what they now have, which will encourage Putin to continue his efforts to pursue outright military victory. Or they can launch successive counteroffensive operations with the twin aims of persuading Putin to accept a negotiated compromise, or of creating military realities sufficiently favorable to Ukraine that Kyiv and its Western allies can then effectively freeze the conflict on their own, regardless of Putin's decisions. Those are the options facing Ukraine and the West, as long as Putin continues to believe that he can impose his will by force of Russian arms over however long a period he is willing to fight. And to wrap up the report, the evening update by the General Staff of Ukraine. During the day, the enemy carried out 7 airstrikes and 10 missile strikes, carried out more than 15 attacks from rocket salvo systems on the positions of our troops and the civilian infrastructure of populated areas. S-300 anti-aircraft guided missiles continue to be widely used for missile strikes. The probability of launching missile and airstrikes on the entire territory of Ukraine remains high. The enemy is concentrating its main efforts on conducting offensive actions in the Liman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Marinka directions. The fiercest battles continue for Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Marinka. Thanks to professional and coordinated actions, units of the Defense Forces of Ukraine repelled 41 enemy attacks in the specified directions during the day. In the Kupiansk and Liman directions, the enemy conducted unsuccessful offensive actions in the areas of Sinkivka and Bilohorivka settlements. In the direction of Bakhmut, the enemy continues its assault on the city of Bakhmut, which is held by our defenders, as well as in the Ivanivske district of the Donetsk region. In the Avdiivka and Marinka directions, the enemy carried out offensive actions in the direction of Novokalinove, Stepove, Avdiivka, Siverne, Pervomaiske, Nevelske, and Marinka of the Donetsk Oblast without success. The enemy continues to conduct defensive actions in the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson directions. And that concludes the report. Should you be interested in the details to any of the articles I mentioned, you can find links to them in the description as usual. If you enjoyed the report and found it informative, please consider sharing it with others and giving me a like. I hope you will join me again tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in and have a great day. You were listening to The Account. Slava Ukraini.